Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Life and Happiness Podcast run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano. Happy Friday, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Let's see, what's been the most interesting thing in the news these past few days? The only thing which comes to mind is all the controversy regarding Dr. Seuss. So I'm curious. What do you guys think of those children's books? Is anything wrong with Cat in the Hat? Why is there something wrong, or is there nothing wrong with them? Like, seriously, I want to hear your thoughts. Put it below. I want to hear what the normal, everyday person actually thinks of these. I don't know else how to put it than these old children's books that we all grew up with. Anyways, so let's get on to the subject matter for today. So the question of the day, is there any way to get something without a cost? Is there any way to get something actually for free? Or is someone always going to pay that cost, whether or not be you or someone else? And the reason why I ask this is because, well, there are two competing philosophies, worldviews about how the world should be, and they essentially come at it from two different ways. There's the freedom from cost, which is expressed most well by socialism, communism, all those types of ideologies which essentially want to create programs where government itself passes on these. It chooses people who get these services, and these services are simply given to them. There's no other way really I can put it, where it takes wealth from one section. It says it takes wealth from one sector to produce something and then give it to another sector of the society. Essentially, freedom of cost by forcing someone else to pay for it. And the other version, the other competing philosophy, is this idea of freedom from coercion. What that means is no one is allowed to use physical force or the threat of physical force to force you to do something. And both of those go completely against one another. Because let's go back to the scenario of freedom of cost, where it's the only way we make it so that you pay no cost of it is if we force someone else to take the burden of that cost. And because it's something run through the state, and the state's the only institution that essentially can use force legitimately, that's the only institution imbued with that power, then, of course, if you disobey their edicts, then they can use the government gun to go then and force one group to do something for the benefit of another group. And that's simply what it is. It's through the use of force. Versus in freedom of coercion, you can't just do that. You can't just take from one just to give from another if that one doesn't consent to it. Instead, you must rely upon charity, people willing to give what they have to someone else willing to give what they have to someone else simply for the other person's benefit, because they will receive nothing in return. So, we will be discussing the differences between those two competing ideas and their impacts on how people conduct their lives, especially through this idea of sacrifice. And for our final segment, I'm gonna make some bolder assertions. I think that if you live by the freedom from cost, it will make you unhappy. So I'm gonna go through 7 reasons why I think freedom from cost makes people unhappy, dissatisfied with their current situation, and ultimately their lives. So we'll get onto that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, hear rebuttals. I know there are a wide variety of opinions on these subjects, and I've thought it through and read much about both of these competing ideas. I want to lay out how they work on both sides, and including their assumptions about what humans are like, under assumptions about what the natural world is like, and show you why I come to the conclusions which I come to. So now let's get into these base ideas which undergird the both of them, freedom from cost and freedom from coercion. Because both of them have a theory of what humans are like, and also of what human history has been like. So let's get started with freedom from cost. We're going to go through that. I don't know if any of you have heard this person, of this philosopher, this French philosopher. I believe his full name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I don't remember which era he was born in, but he was pre-French Revolution. And he was most famous for his conception of, in the only reason why people are unhappy is because of society itself. Society and its rules hamper the natural man, hamper his desires, hampers his passions. And only because they are hampered, then people act unjustly. People act essentially criminally. If you removed all these strictures of society, everyone would be sharing everything, everyone would be at peace, everyone would be doing their own thing easily, essentially. It's the idea of the noble savage, which you've seen time and time again. Think of Pocahontas, the original Disney movie. Oronoco, it's supposedly a biography of a slave. When now we understand it to be a novel. Both of those depict man in almost a state of paradise, as a state like Adam and Eve, where no one knows sin, no one knows how to do wrong. Everything is genuine and innocent. And if you take many history classes today, they'll give that kind of perspective about the Native American tribes on both continents. Which, if you then go extend to how history has been, it's not really the case. And I'll get into that more later. Because ultimately what undergirds this idea of the past, this conception of history, that it's only the societies, the more civilized that we become, the more dehumanized we become, is this idea that humans are innately good. That humans, bar anything else, until you put those influences upon them, are good from birth. They're pure, they're virtuous, all these things. Which, I don't know about you, but any of you who have met children, especially young children, I don't know how you could think that's the case. Especially considering how many times parents have to remind kids, say thank you, say you're welcome, say please. If humans were naturally good, then you would have to only tell them once and they would get it. But because it's hard to be grateful, a point that I've mentioned over and over again. You have to keep telling your kid, not just once, not just twice, but I have no idea how many thousands of times we have to tell our kids to be grateful for the things that they have, to say thank you, to share. We have to train people to be good. So that's one of their premises, and one that I find wrong, but that goes into this idea of freedom of cost, and it's a supporting pillar of how all that works. And the other thing, because on these past few episodes, we've discussed human nature, and not just human nature, individual nature, male-female nature, that there is something which binds humans together and runs concurrently through all of us. And you can see it through history, through our stories, and it goes back millennia. That the fact that we can identify with, like, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which goes back, if I'm correct, I think 3,000 years, probably longer. Actually, probably longer than that. But the fact that we can identify with that kind of story, an ancient epic made by humans who lived in a completely different part of the world with a completely different culture than we do, but the same kind of elements that we write in our own stories are still there in their stories. The only conclusion which I can think of which makes sense is the fact that there is a human nature. But to the idea that humans are naturally good, it's compounded also by the idea, and that Rousseau and many other later thinkers would support this notion, that human nature doesn't exist. Or if it does exist, it's a blank slate and it's completely malleable. You can turn humans into whatever you want them to be. And, well, you see those kinds of things today. Arguments kind of against truth and reality. I don't know if you paid attention to news to this extent, but some outlets will argue that we are in a post-truth world, where the truth itself doesn't matter. It's only how people portray something to be, its representations. And if you go deeper into philosophies which essentially have this idea of freedom of cost, so this would go into postmodernism, this would go into Marxism, this would go essentially what's typically put left-leaning ideologies, and I could explain that in a different podcast. But what runs through them all is ultimately an atheistic proposition that values themselves don't exist, and humans can be whatever they want them to be. That it's a purely material world. And because things are material, like purely material, that means there's only, I am only the atoms that make me up. There is only everything I can see, touch, hear, feel. There is nothing more to the world than that. Then values fall out the window. And think about this. How do you prove something is right or wrong? How do you know that it's not just your opinion? And I'm the one where I truly don't think you can prove something with the same certainty that, I can prove that an earthquake was magnitude 6. It's not a science. Science can't explain values. And these philosophies, which go into freedom of cost, they accept that assertion. And they run with it so to the point that the only way to make things better, the only way to make people happier, is to just give people... It's okay to... because there are no rules of how you should act, they accept that proposition. Then they assert that to make people happy, they are justified in taking from one group and giving it to another group. It's simply, and it doesn't really matter what descriptions you want to put it at. If you want to describe it by race or religion or by class or by gender or anything. It's simply the idea that if you level the playing field completely, make it so that everyone starts at the same point and ends at the same point, this idea of equity that we hear now, that people will be happy, people will be at peace, and everything will be perfect. That's a simple notion. That's the guiding principle behind all those ideas, all those differing philosophies. That's more like the through line, the commonplace thing, which essentially binds them all together. This idea of equity, this idea of freedom from cost. And as I pointed out, there are issues with that kind of thinking. There are issues with the idea that you can make it so that there's no cost whatsoever, because someone's always going to pay for it. You're just changing who's paying for it. And also the fact that they think humans are naturally good. Well, accept it. I don't know whether they think it, but it definitely is a supporting line of that philosophy. And also that there is nothing to human nature, which I find hard to believe. So, that was my run-up of freedom of cost. We'll get into freedom of coercion in the next segment, and its different assumptions. And I really do want to hear your thoughts on this. See if anything I said made you realize something or consider something in a different light. Hope maybe I did. Or maybe you have something which could make me think back my assertions and figure out maybe there's something more correct I could say. Or maybe come to a completely different conclusion. Anyways, we'll come back in the next segment. We'll see you all soon.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello and welcome back to the second segment of the Life and Happiness podcast run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into it, shall we? So, last segment, we were talking about freedom from cost. One of two competing worldviews on essentially how the West should be run. It's in every part of society, and both sides are coming at one another. Freedom of cost versus freedom of coercion. Freedom from coercion. And ultimately, the core idea behind both of them, it's more like a trinity of ideas. It's the idea of what human history is like, what human nature is like, and the necessity of sacrifice. And I'm not talking about sacrifice as in the old sense of where, people would burn something at the altar for their god. Though that, in essence, is the same kind of idea where you give up something in order to get something in the future. And we do that all the time. It's like, hey, I'm giving up this piece of chocolate cake so that I don't gain the weight because I want to keep my diet. Like, think about it like that. Or I'm sacrificing some time spent with friends and family so I can keep working harder and maybe find more success in the future. There are plenty of examples in the real world that we do that kind of thing. And for freedom of cost, it's this idea that if you removed all the rules on society, if you just gave everyone their needs, everyone would be happy, everyone would be kind, everyone would share. It's ultimately this idea that humans are naturally good. If left alone to their own devices, humans would be good, just following their passions innocently, No one would think to hurt one another. No one would think to steal from one another. But as I asserted, kids, you have to teach them to be good or else they're horrible. And any of you who've worked with kids, I'm sure you recognize this. Kids can be the worst. And it's not out of malice. They just don't. It's out of innocence. They're doing these things because they think these things will benefit them. And sometimes they have benefited them because acting that way can bring you benefits. So I think there are issues with the idea that humans are naturally good. And the other is that, human nature doesn't exist. That there's nothing unifying between every single human being. You can make humans into whatever you want them to be. And the reason why I have hesitance with that idea is, there you get those types, those authoritarian types who they consider that they know exactly how everyone else should act so that everything could be better. And the only way they'll implement that is by force. And those would be those types like, Hitler for one, and also Stalin, and also Mao, and also Pol Pot, and all those types which use military force or police force to implement their will and force it over everyone else. Big time bullies, think about it that way. And it's because they think they can bend humans to their will, because there is nothing there, nothing of substance that holds its own, that resists other forces, that so long as they do it strong enough, they can just make everything perfect. And you see how, if you study history, you know that those things fall apart. Resistance always comes. And in the end, those people lose power. And it's always a mess. It's always a bloody mess. So those are the two main ideas why I think freedom of cost is not necessarily the best way to look at the world. But now we have freedom of coercion. What does that mean? And where is that shown? So freedom from coercion is the idea that I, as an individual, have no right to force my will upon you. I can't use physical force or the threat of physical force to make you do what I want. So that comes with some distinct ideas, which are completely separate from the rest. From freedom of cost, which you don't get through many other ways. So, implicit there is that I have free will, and you have free will. And that free will should be respected. That's ultimately what that means. And the fact that I can't hurt you means that I am not allowed to hurt you, means that there's something sanctified, something sacred about, at the very least, human life, that you can't just damage it for no reason. Think about it as John Stuart Mill. He's famous for saying the only place where force is justified is in self-defense. Other than that, you may not force your will upon someone else. And by force, he also means physical force. Because then you might consider, what about all those advertisements and, all those mental things? Well, ultimately, a part of freedom of coercion is the thought that you ultimately are the one that makes that choice. And none of those other things are stronger than you. So long as you're truly trained how to act free. Because as we've mentioned before, human nature is something which goes hand in hand with the idea of freedom of coercion. It recognizes that for you to be able to act free, you need to learn that you're free in the first place, and learn how to combat your own nature, how to combat the passions. Have you ever considered why colleges are sometimes named liberal arts schools, and especially many older colleges? The reason why they're named liberal arts schools is because the university itself was conceived in as idea where people learned to be free. People learned to be in touch with the higher parts of themselves and not listen to the baser natures. Meaning that someone who practices it could learn that even though their instincts are telling them, hey, that looks a big juicy burger on the billboard, I should go get that burger, that you can control that passion and then decide if that's actually something you want to do or if it's just a spur of the moment urge. And you all should know the difference. Think about all the times you've just felt these spur of the moment urges. You're really strong right then and there, but then you let them sit for a while and they dissipate and then they don't bother you after more. But then you also know the other side of that, where it's a decision you really do want to make and it's on your mind, and then you choose to indulge in that choice. And that's a completely different scenario. It's either your whims are dominating what you do at every moment, or your mind is watching what you want to do and all the different things which are telling you why you want to do it, and then coming to the decision of what is in your best self-interest. And ultimately, in society is based on the idea of liberty. Freedom of coercion is the dominant principle. Politics doesn't even make sense if people aren't free to choose. And also, if they aren't free to choose what's in their own self-interest. And, well, it comes in part and parcel with a lot of other ideas that come built into it. So, one, freedom of cost doesn't assert that you have rights. It's only freedom of coercion, which does. Like, right to life, meaning, the best way I can describe it, like, I'm not allowed just to kill you. If I have no justification for it, I can't just do that. Because partly, I'm not allowed to threaten you with that force in the first place. That's one of those. That's one of those that's in there. And I suppose you can make an argument for freedom of speech as well, because speech has no force behind it. But there is a lot more which goes into it, but that would require me going beyond the idea of freedom coercion and extending to how we get those ideas in the first place. So instead I'll continue on to, well, why into the assumptions on supporting freedom of coercion, like I did for freedom of cost. Because part of it is the assumption that humans aren't naturally good. It doesn't assume that humans are evil, but it doesn't assume the best intentions of humans. It doesn't assume that humans left to their own devices, that way they will be up to the greatest good that they could be. Part of freedom of coercion. My bad. Part of freedom of coercion is the idea that, well, humans do need to be bound by some kind of code of law, that the rules need to be in place, and we're free to do everything within those rules. And I guess the biggest rule that would need to be enforced, and this would be the reason for the government, would be that to protect people from infringing upon that right of others to not be coerced into an action. Basically, the role of the state in the mindset of those people who support freedom from coercion is to make sure the rules are fair for everyone. So long as everyone is playing by the same game, everyone can be left to their own devices. Freedom from cost, instead, well, it uses that same principle of force, which freedom of coercion uses to make everything fair. Freedom from cost uses it to take from one group and give it to another. And while on top of quashing dissent with that same force. So the way the government's established on either principle results in very different uses of the same tools. And another part of it is, well, almost like a respect for individual human beings. That because of their natures, because of how we are, every human being deserves a basic modicum of respect. Because they're a free being, just like you are. And they have the ability to make their own choice. Every individual is the best person to make a choice for their own self-interest. Meaning, I know what's best for me. You know what's best for you. They know what's best for them. And because they're the only one in their shoes. I don't know the details of their situation. I could prescribe something, but I could be wrong. And you know what? It also means people are going to do things you don't like. And those things you don't like are not necessarily wrong, or illegal. But people, so long as they aren't infringing on what you wanted, if they're not forcing their will upon you, then you know what? They're allowed to go do the things which you don't like. Because, well, I'm sure you do things that they don't like. And so long as we support each other's ability to do that kind of thing, we can live in the same place. We can have these disagreements and still share a beer with one another, relax over the games, and have some sense of peace. Because freedom of choice understands that there's a human nature. Freedom of coercion understands that there is a human nature which must be respected. And every individual has their own individual nature. On top of that, it maximizes the ability of the citizenry to do what they wish to do with their own lives, and minimizes the role of the state. So that it creates it's based on the idea that people should go and be the best individual they can be and however they want to do, so long as they're not afflicting everyone else. So it's either human nature is good, and that there is, which is somehow contrasted, or humans are naturally good, and that there is no human nature for freedom of cost. Those are its supporting principles, versus human nature is at the very least corrupted. It's not bad, but it's not good either. It's has both. And more often than not, the bad dominates the good, which is why the state is needed to keep the game fair and protect everyone, protect those rights, so that then people within those restrictions can aim for the good and live at peace with one another. So those are the main two ideas, the main two philosophies. So I want to hear what your thoughts are so far on what I've described. Have I described things accurately? Have I just described things in a wrong way? Is there something more you'd like to build upon that? Put that into the comments below. And don't forget, in the fourth segment, we'll be going into why I think freedom from cost makes people into unhappy people. Anyways, we'll get into that later, and we'll see you back here soon.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the third segment of today's episode of the Life and Happiness podcast run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into it. Last segment, I spoke on freedom of coercion, what it is, and ideas which support it, ideas which are the assumptions which allow it to kind of exist as a philosophy, essentially. And I didn't mention, but that's essentially what the guiding principle behind liberty-minded philosophies. So that would be classical liberalism, that would be conservatism, that would be essentially capitalism, and American principles, but Western principles at large. If you've ever read the Magna Carta, if you ever read the British Constitution, or English common law, you would see that these same principles actually do extend there as well. That liberty-minded, that rights-minded look at the world. And if you at all have studied or read the Bible and also understood what influenced the American philosophy, you'd see how many of the principles which allow for freedom of coercion to exist ultimately go back to that 2,000-year-old book. And if you take the Old Testament accounts correctly, then it should go back at least 3,000 years. Okay, yeah, so the Epic of Gilgamesh is older than 3,000 years. Okay, that's good for me to remember. Anyways, so it's all those are influenced by these ideas that individual humans have rights and duties to uphold. That my right to not hurt you, that your right to not be coerced by force is my duty not to coerce you in that manner. And you could take that same kind of line of logic for the rights like freedom of speech. My right to free speech is supported by your duty to not censor my speech. So I went over that and contrasted it slightly against the backdrop of, freedom of cost, which is supported by the idea that humans are naturally good and that there is no human nature. You can mold humans into whatever you want them to be. And ultimately, I think you can split it down even further to the view of the anointed versus what's it called? Thomas Sowell uses a very specific name for this other side. Okay, yeah, I remember. It's a constrained vision versus the unconstrained vision. The unconstrained vision being the view of the anointed. That's what it's called. And essentially, the idea is, do you think people can run their own lives? Do you think people can do what's the best for themselves and improve their situation? Or do you think that, no, people can't do that? And only by having the enlightened few, the moral supermen in charge, that everything can be perfect. And there's no real difference between the two, because one tends towards the accumulation of power and one tends towards the dispersal of power. Because if you really do believe that people can make the best decisions for themselves, that people don't need someone guiding them all the time, then power will naturally extend. You will take, if you can help push things towards an end where the individual citizens have more power, then yeah, you will do that. Versus if you believe that the anointed few have all the wisdom in the world to run everything perfectly, run your life for you, then you will move things in a way so that power accumulates in that few. And there is nothing really to stay static. It's only in one direction or the other. And I think that goes back to what I spoke in the last podcast, where things will always change. It's nothing really you can stop. I think maybe specific things don't change, but change always happens in some form. It will affect something. So you have to keep up at it. It's either it's going to go one way, but if you lighten the force, then it's going to go back the other way. So those are those two ideas. Thomas Sowell describes it much more eloquently than I could in his book, A Conflict of Visions. And if you're curious more on freedom of coercion, then I would suggest Milton Friedman. And what's the name of his book? Because he has multiple. Free to Choose. That's the book you should choose. And also there's a video series of it on YouTube. I would highly recommend those. Versus, what would be the best way to describe to you what freedom of cost is? What would you read which explores that scenario? The only thing which comes to mind which can do it justice is the Communist Manifesto, for the reason being it describes the institutions which has power and how it wants to wrest that power away from them and disperse it on everyone else. It's interesting because when you're reading it, it highlights how it complains about oppression and all this, but then it justifies the use of oppression on another group so that they can benefit the working class. And that just goes back to how I was describing it, where freedom of cost is essentially moving cost from one group to another. Because, for example, let's say I wanted to build you a house. I wanted to give you this house, but there's no house. But I want you to not pay for it. So either I will build it, or I'm going to make someone else go build it. But someone has to build the house. There's no house without the work that goes into it. There's no house without sacrifice. So, it's, when you're looking at the natural world, you have to think about these things. I feel like a lot of, this actually goes back to the gratitude idea that we were talking about. So, you know how I've discussed where if things are good, you kind of accept that that's the norm. You don't realize how things are so much worse in other places. I think by us being in a nation where there is a lot of wealth all over the place, we have it so good here. I think most Americans are in the top 1% of the world's of the wealthy people in the whole world. We tend to take that this is we tend to take this as normal when it's extremely rare. Poverty is the normal state of the world. There's no such thing as wealth in the natural world. Like if you look at fossils, if you look at just ecosystems, just remove humans from the mix. There's no such thing as like veterinary hospitals. There's no such thing as dog homes for the wolves. There's like all those things are things which are created. In the natural state of the world, there is no technology, there is no clothing, there is no higher calorie food, because a lot of the things which have made humans blossom is the fact that we can produce so much food and energy-rich food. We've produced so much of it that we can actually focus on doing other things. We've freed up our time to go do much more. Also, if you look at the success of the United States, a big part of it is minimizing how much of the populace needs to be working on farms to produce enough food, not just to feed all of us, but in our own country, but most of the world. One of the things which does separate the United States from everywhere else is how much food we actually do produce. Go look the numbers. It's something amazing. My friend Sal, who's from the Central Valley, he's described to me is that 70% of the world's food is all made here in the Central Valley, and he's seen that all kind of growing up, especially because he lives in a town where the World Ag Expo comes, and you meet all the farmers and see all the work that they do. It's kind of an amazing thing. But that's not the normal state. The normal state is no food. The normal state is you're scrounging for scraps. The normal state is you're cold at night. The normal state is you get a cut, it gets infected, and you die at 16. The world is harsh. And a big part of the ideas we discussed is without humans at all, the world is hard enough alone. There's hurricanes, there's earthquakes, there's fires, there's disease. And all of that is painful. And on top of how hard you have to work to make food in the first place. But then you have to come at it with the idea that it's not just that we have to contend with that. And I think humans can contend with that. I think the average person can deal with the harshness of the real world. But what breaks people down is how horrible humans can be. And I put the emphasis on can because I've also asserted how good humans can be as well. How wondrous having a life partner can be. And the amazing things which humans can rise to. But that doesn't eliminate the fact that humans can be one of the worst things which come around. For the reason that people choose to hurt other people. A big part of being human is that we recognize we're vulnerable in a way that other animals don't. We know our own weaknesses. We know how we can hurt, and therefore we know how we can hurt each other. And people choose to do that all the time. People have that horrible capacity. So it's bad enough that life itself is suffering. The life itself has lots of pain. That the only things guaranteed are suffering and death. But then on top of that, you know what? Sometimes someone's just going to stab a knife into your back and twist it. That kind of makes it unbearable. And this is why I put so much emphasis on you need to live your life in a way such that it's worth dealing with all of that. And you're strong enough to handle the sways of life, the ups and downs and all that. Because the ups and downs are going to happen. Suffering is unavoidable. And that ultimately is where I think freedom of cost goes wrong. Because it wants to put freedom of cost ultimately wants to put the blame on others. It wants to say that, you know what, the only reason why we're suffering is because others caused the suffering. But I think it misses the point that life itself, even without humans being horrible, is horrible. It's hard, it's painful, it's incredibly painful. And it's easy to give up. It's easy to give in. It's easy to be unhappy. It's easy to go be evil. The hardest thing is to look all that pain in the face and choose to act virtuously anyways. To choose to listen to the good side of yourself. To listen to the part which tells you how much better you could become. Because you know what? It's going to hurt you. You have to deal with your weaknesses. You have to deal with the pain. And it's going to keep coming every single day. And sometimes it can beat you. Some days it will get the better of you. But to have the resolve to get back up anyways, to stand and keep going, it's that journey which ultimately produces a life with meaning and creates people which not only have the strength to take care of themselves, but dramatically improve the lives of everyone else around them. That pillar which keeps everyone steady. And I do think that's the right path. I think that's the only path which makes sense, because it's the only thing I can think of which creates a sensation that all the unjust suffering that we deal with, all the randomness to the world, on top of the malevolence of others, is the only thing which makes it worth getting up every single day. With us, not just getting up getting up with a smile on your face and ready to charge into it. It's the only way to thrive. To truly live that life well lived. And we'll see. I think that's true. I think all of that is true. But we'll see. I really wonder what you all think about this. Comment below with your thoughts. And we're going to come back in the next segment. 7 ways I think freedom of cost goes wrong, makes you unhappy. And we'll see you soon.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello and welcome back everyone to the final segment of today's episode of the Life and Happiness Podcast run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into it. So all today we've been talking about these competing ideas of freedom of cost versus freedom of coercion. And ultimately, I think freedom of cost is the wrong way to go. And this segment, my 7 reasons why I think it makes people unhappy, we'll explore more into that. And ultimately, I think freedom from coercion is along the right way to go, but it's not enough. It's more like one of the conclusions you would draw from what I think are the right ways to look at humans and, well, human history at large, how people are, how they can grow into what they could be. So let's get into the list, starting with number 1. So think about humans. Enough is never enough. You know, think about like kids. If they could always have more, they would want more. And well, just people are never satisfied with where they are. There's always something more which they could want, more desires. Be it like, just put it like, let's say, if I could have something right now which would make which, you know, I would like to have something. I could think of something. I could think of, plenty of Switch games would be fun to have. I could think of books that I would want to get to complete my library. I would think of the different clothes, or maybe something I could do to my car. Like, there's always something I could want. And see, the problem with the freedom of cost thing is, well, if humans could get what they would want for free and at no limits, who's going to supply it? How, like, honestly, people would want so much, you would run out of stuff. Like, if people could just go in and take things from a store, they would take everything. Think of like a Black Friday. That's one great example of that, where things are supposedly such a low price. I've never been to a Black Friday, so I don't know. But you see the videos of people fighting for all the cheap gear. And, well, that's just kind of like a sad fact. It's more like, I forget who's a philosopher who put it this way, but this was funny. Milton Friedman mentions this quote, where if socialism were to work, you would need every single citizen to have 2 houses and 2 slaves. And then Milton Friedman was like, and the slaves too? And the guy was like, yes. Meaning that there's never enough to fuel that kind of desire of keep giving everyone everything that they could want. And ultimately you won't be satisfied. And that this dissatisfaction tends to lead towards, well, general unhappiness. And let's go on to the next one, number 2. Being unsatisfied, and this is more just a general thing, people tend to victimize themselves. And it goes both ways. It's either from the bottom or from the top. From the bottom, you're in a position, well, I'm suffering in a way where I'm unique. No one else is suffering the way I am. If only things were just kind of given to me. If only I could just take it from everyone else. It's angry. It's this mentality that feeling all these desires of freedom of cost. And this could be more specific examples. I'm going to use Nazi Germany now, where Germany is suffering because the Jews are stealing their wealth, because the Jews are making everything worse. And because the Germans victimized themselves, then they justified taking it out on those other people. Or there's also the other way around, where it's someone at the top, or someone at the top thinks they're entitled to something, that they shouldn't have a cost for getting that specific thing. And therefore, if it's restricted to them, they're justified in taking back through any means what they rightly deserve, because they believe they rightly deserve it. And let's see, the best example of that. What's a good real world example of that? What I would honestly describe would probably be, well, the things with big tech nowadays, where they're deciding essentially the censorship that's running through, and the amount of power that these companies wield, that they think they can decide what's okay for everyone to say, whether or not there actually is a push from everyday people to do something like that. That's like the best example of the high and mighty wanting something a certain way and justifying any means because they don't want to have to deal with the costs of doing such a thing. It's because I don't have it, it should be given to me. That's that mentality which the freedom of cost tends to breed. And if you want more on specifics of that, I would highly urge you to read The Gulag Archipelago. And that explains how this mentality afflicted the Soviet Union and all of its citizenry. The corruption went from the bottom to the top. It wasn't just a few bad people in power. That couldn't have happened without the support of the masses. And a corollary of this is number 3. Because you victimize yourself, you demonize other people. And I mentioned with Nazi Germany, for them it was the Jews. In Soviet Union, it was anyone with a modicum of power, anyone with some kind of wealth. Like the kulaks were just poor peasant farmers, but because they were doing better enough than everyone else just to have a house and a few animals, if you read the stories what happened, intellectuals would come into the town, tell everyone how evil that person was for stealing from everyone else. And that should be theirs. They should just take it. They shouldn't have to work for it because it was rightly theirs. And they massacred those people and tossed them in prison. Or it's horrifying. And the thing is, since those people were the only ones who knew how to farm well, it led to the famine, which I forget the numbers. I think that killed 2 million people. The Ukrainian famine. Yeah, but now, going back from that real life example, think about what it does to you to harbor that kind of hatred for someone, to have that in your heart, that whenever you see or think about this group, all you just have is that resentment, that anger, that urge to lash out against them. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that's a big block in the way from you being a happy person. And then here's another consequence of this, but now we're going less from the aggression to another aspect of freedom of cost, and that one is called number 4. You absolve yourself from responsibility, and think about it this way: the bigger the state, the smaller the citizen. Why should I give from what I have to the poor? Because I know that Because I know that, well, the state's going to take care of them anyway. Essentially, whose responsibility is it to take care of people? In a society where it's based on freedom of coercion, and especially if you read Democracy in America and take a look at how people viewed the poor in their cities, they thought it was their own responsibility to take care of everyone, to give what they had to those that didn't have. And many societies and things were built up so that the poor could be educated. It's a brilliant read, and I do suggest Democracy in America. But in other locations, well, actually, the best book that describes it for the modern world is comparing Europe and the United States. It's called Who Really Cares? Look it up on the internet. And what it does is it compares which groups in the Western world actually do donate more to charity. And Americans overwhelmingly donate more of their own incomes, no matter across all income levels, to the poor and to charities, unlike Europe. And that is because most of Europe has built this deep welfare system, which is now, people are raised to think it's the state's job to take care of everyone. I don't have to do anything. Versus, it's still in many places here in the United States, it's a lot, we still have that core from our past, which is, yes, I am responsible not just for me, but for my family and then my community, in that order. I have to be individually responsible, which allows me to take care of other people if I have the ability to. And, well, in that same book, Who Really Cares, they go into it and they find that it's the more devout religious people, specifically Christian and Jews, who do donate overwhelmingly more than the rest of the nation. And, well, I just kind of find that interesting because it's also, it's more of like, as I mentioned earlier, how freedom of coercion is more of an inference from older principles. Its whole reason for existence depends on things such as human rights. It depends such as things as the value of the individual. And, well, those principles are deeply enshrined in the texts of the Bible, if you've ever given it a good read to study it. And what this book suggests is that those principles do influence people to take care of them more because they see it as their responsibility, not only to their community, but to their God, to actually donate to other people, to take care of the widow, the orphan. It's, if I remember specifically, that is a law in Exodus, and I think it's mentioned again in Numbers and Deuteronomy. And not to mention in many places after the initial Torah. But I just kind of find that interesting, where the emphasis on, well, there are costs, and if you have the ability to give, that you should give. When that's emphasized more versus in places where they remove that responsibility from you and they place it somewhere else, well, it actually does result in a difference in how people are charitable to other people. It makes people more selfless, more giving. And we'll go on to the next three, which are all kind of related. Happiness, freedom of cost makes you think, number 5, that happiness is somehow connected to material success. And, well, if that were true, then rich people would be the happiest people on earth, and also Americans would be the happiest people on earth because we're the top 1% of the world economy. But as a whole, like, all our citizens, nearly all our citizens. But the interesting thing, if you look specifically at the U.S., we have some of the highest depression rates and suicide rates that we've ever had. And also we've had for the past few years, for the first time in American history, well, except for, I think last year was the first year to change that again, that the life expectancy was actually starting to drop because of, well, rampant suicides in certain communities. And especially, look at the depression rates in my generation. Just anyone from like 10 to 25. They're not good. They're not good. And it also connects to that, what we've mentioned at the top, where having is never going to be enough. So if you keep thinking that your happiness is dependent on having just as much as other people, you'll realize that there will never be a specific amount where, okay, then now I'm satisfied. So that connects to, well, if you just give these things to people, if you give, even if you could put people at an equal level, as many philosophies supporting freedom of cost would urge and want to happen, why would that actually solve the problem? How would you know that's enough? Why would, at that specific level? So freedom of cost goes wrong that way, because if that continue to believe in that misguided idea that, well, having a specific level of material success will make all your dissatisfaction with life go away, well, that's just simply not true. And the next one, which goes with it, is number 6, that maybe happiness is based on just having all the pleasure and avoiding all the pain. But the thing about the moments which are just pleasurable, moments that are just fun, they're fun in the moments, and you can enjoy yourself there. And like, even if you did have that ability where you could just do everything, which is, if you had the material success to do everything which is fun at every moment, which, if, like I mentioned earlier, if you read the Communist Manifesto, you'll see that Marx wants that kind of society. Well, you would know that it only lasts in that moment, and then afterwards it goes away. Afterwards, there's an empty feeling. Because a lot of ways, fun used incorrectly is like a drug, where you need more of it every time. You need that bigger kick. Unless you understand how to use it moderately. Because, well, focusing on constantly having that excitement, that kick, that adrenaline, well, it's not something which is stable. And no matter how much of it that you get, and the best ones that exemplify this kind of idea are Hollywood movie stars that have the access to all the fun, and we could see them. Think about Robin Williams, he committed suicide. Think about all the actors who have committed suicide or gone through drug abuse. All those celebrities who just weren't happy despite all the access to all the fun, to all the material wealth. It's just not what completed who they were, who they could be, or what would make them happy people. And then, so if we see that example all the time, and we write stories about it, we have movies and shows about that kind of situation, why would we think that, well, if we just gave that opportunity to everyone else, it would also make them happy? That just seems kind of misguided. And I've mentioned this already in the podcast, but number 7 is the world just has too much pain. Even if you could if you could give everyone all the material protection in the world, that's not going to stop people from being bad. Someone's just going to do something just to mess it up. And given that the world isn't a utopia, and utopia can't be on this earth, there will never be enough for people. And just imagine what happens with earthquakes, what happens with fires, and all those natural disasters, which just destroys what little people do have. There's just too much pain out there to just believe you could solve it all just by giving everyone. Like, there's not even enough to give to everyone. Like, if you spread all what we had across everyone that does live right now on this earth, it would be infinitesimal. It would be extremely small for each person. The net result would be a net lower material status for everyone across the planet, and that wouldn't do good. That wouldn't be doing good for people. So I don't think it's wrong that people have. What I think what should be aimed for is the people that have should be helping everyone else create their aim towards the same thing, orient their lives towards ending up at a similar place to help others grow. Because, well, it just seems incredibly naive to think that, well, because of how hard life is as a given that we could solve all of its problems just by making everything equal in terms of wealth. But yeah, those are my thoughts on freedom of cost and freedom of coercion and how they tied into everything else that we've been talking about on this show. I really do hope you've enjoyed it. I want to hear what your guys' thoughts are below. I do put a lot of work into trying to figure out to the best of my abilities how deep down these ideas go, and reading in other materials as well. And your input would make these ideas all the more sharper, and so I can give something better back to all of you. Don't forget to comment and subscribe. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, the Twitters, and I'll see you all in the next one. This is Steven Solorzano, signing off.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find the show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitchers, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows. From the GSMC Podcast Network, from sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast.